There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
So long as man is interested in his long past history, in the vicissitudes which our early forerunners passed through, and the varying fare which overtook them, the name of Charles Dawson is certain of remembrance. We do well to link his name to this picturesque corner of Sussex, the scene of his discovery. I have now the honour of unveiling this monolith dedicated to his memory.
That was Sir Arthur Keith, the president of the Anthropological Institute, commemorating a memorial to Charles Dawson, and the year was 1938. Dawson wasn't there to appreciate the words or the memorial. He had died 22 years before. The memorial is actually still standing if you ever want to see it. The stone's a bit weathered, because it's been 77 years since its first dedication in Piltdown, East Sussex, but you still might be able to make out the inscription on it. It reads, "Here in the old gravel, Mr. Charles Dawson, FSA, found the fossil skull of the Piltdown Man, 1912 to 1913. The discovery was described by Mr. Charles Dawson and Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society, 1913 to 1915. Did you catch that? The fossil skull of the Piltdown Man. Who was the Piltdown Man? Or perhaps a better question might be, at least it was then, what was the Piltdown Man? In the late 19th century, Europe was having a grand old time when it came to fossils of ancient hominids. In 1856, the first Neanderthal man specimen was discovered in the Neander Valley. In 1909, skulls were found in France that also belonged to the Neanderthal. France was also home to the Cro-Magnons, another early form of modern humans. Europe had been a hotbed of activity 100,000 years ago, with Homo sapiens emerging as the dominant race around 25 to 40,000 years ago when the last Neanderthal faded from view. With the discovery of these early humans and the realization that we were not the only species of hominid to migrate north, there began a mad search for what was to be known as the missing link. The term means very little to science today, but back then it meant a link between mankind and apes. So digging continued. Everywhere but in England. England was the odd man out when it came to fossils of early man. The English had to sit back and watch as skulls were unearthed in Germany, France, and even Italy. English shovels turned up, well, not really much at all, except loads of gravel. Until one day,
I was walking along a farm road close to Piltdown Common.
This is amateur archaeologist and fossil collector Charles Dawson.
When I noticed that the road had been mended with some peculiar brown flints, not usual in the district. Upon inquiry, I was astonished to learn that they were dug from a gravel bed on the farm. And shortly afterwards I visited the place, where two labourers were at work digging the gravel for small repairs to the road. I asked the workmen if they'd found bones or other fossils there. I urged them to preserve anything that they might find.
And Dawson didn't have to wait too long either. The exact year is unknown, but things did begin to turn up in that gravel pit. Strange things.
Upon one of my subsequent visits to the pit, one of the men handed to me a small portion of an unusually thick human parietal bone. I immediately made a search, but could find nothing more. Nor had the men noticed anything else. In fact, the bed seemed to be quite unfossiliferous.
And then in the autumn of 1911,
on a subsequent visit to the spot, that I picked up, among the rain-washed spoil heaps of the gravel pit, another and larger piece.
when all was said and done, Dawson had in his possession parts of a skull and jawbone. This was in 1912. Dawson showed his find to Teilhard de Chardin, a young Jesuit priest and paleontologist. Working with Deschardins and Arthur Smith Woodward, then keeper of the British Museum's Natural History, Dawson prepared to announce his find to the Geological Society of London. You can imagine the excitement that was generated by this. Up until this time, England hadn't been home to a single fossil, at least not one that belonged to an early form of man. But here was what some were calling the missing link. According to Woodward, the skull was very close to being that of a modern human. But there were differences. The brain size was smaller, for one, by about a third, and the jawbone was not much different from that of a chimpanzee. And stranger still was the teeth. 2 of the molars were distinctly human-like. Woodward then stunned the scientific community of England by proposing what some were already hoping. Charles Dawson had found the missing link. The find was granted the name Eonthropus dawsoni, or Dawson's Dawn Man. The rest of the world knew it as the Piltdown Man. And to say it was controversial would be putting it lightly. Debate raged as to its true origin and genotype. Was it the link between man and ape? The jawbone seemed to suggest as much. If it was more ape-like than man, who could argue the point? Especially considering the brain pan resembled that of a modern man. In 1915, Dawson did it again. He presented pieces of a second skull, this time from a spot not more than a couple of miles away from where the Piltdown Man had originally been discovered. Now, if anyone was doubting the first find, the second one all but sealed the deal. Along with the skull came what appeared to be an elephant tusk that had been shaped into some sort of tool. It was jokingly referred to as the Piltdown Man's cricket bat. Now, if anyone was laughing, the laughter soon transformed into stunned silence when the team, meaning Dawson and Woodward, placed the age of the skull at 500,000 years. This identified the Piltdown Man as being the oldest human relative discovered, ever. And in England, no less. Charles Dawson's celebration was short-lived, at least his personal celebration. He died a year later of septicemia. But the world's fascination with the Piltdown Man continued. Researchers and paleontologists were eager to get their hands on the remains, and one of those was German anthropologist Franz Wiedenreich. Wiedenreich was a professor at the University of Heidelberg, and he was keenly interested in the find. Now, imagine his surprise, and the surprise of others, when his examination led him to suspect fraud. He concluded his study by calling the Piltdown Man a chimera. According to Wiedenreich, something was terribly wrong with it. Namely, the skull and the mandible. They were of 2 different species. Not a mix of 2 species, but 2 separate individuals altogether. The skull belonged to a modern human being, and the jaw, he said, once belonged to an orangutan. And the peculiar teeth? They were filed down. So, what did people think of Wiedenreich's conclusions? Well, not much, apparently. They were pushed into the status of a dissenting footnote and quickly forgotten. He was, surprisingly, ignored. To further clarify this, or to add salt to Wiedenreich's wounds, his study of the Piltdown Man remains took place in 1923. 15 years later, in 1938, Sir Arthur Keith, renowned anatomist and paleontologist, presented the Piltdown Man Memorial that was mentioned at the beginning of this episode to mark the location of the original discovery in Sussex. So, what was Wiedenreich's reaction to being virtually ignored in his assertion that there was trickery afoot? Well, history doesn't tell us. Wiedenreich died in 1948. Had he lived 7 more years, just 7 years, he would have been alive to have heard the following broadcast on the BBC.
In 1949, Dr. Kenneth Oakley of the British Museum of Natural History applied an entirely new method of dating fossils, the fluorine method, to the material from Piltdown.
Fluorine is a poisonous element, rather like chlorine, which is absorbed by bones from the water in soil or subsoil in which they are buried.
The fluorine test mentioned in the broadcast had been performed in 1949 by a team of scientists. Now, that team consisted of Kenneth Oakley, Joseph Viner, and Sir Wilfrid Edward Le Gros Clark. Now, what the fluorine test allowed them to do was to measure the amounts of fluorine in the bones. And it works especially well with bones that have been buried in the ground. Now, over time, the fluorine content will increase. By measuring the level, one can determine if bones found in the same area are roughly of the same age. This wasn't the case with the skull and jaw of the Piltdown Man. They were of different times and different animals. Not just two animals, but three. On November 21st, 1953, the New York Times declared that the Piltdown Man hoax is exposed. The bones had been treated with an iron and chromic acid solution to give the appearance of age. The jaw was, in fact, that of an orangutan, as had been reported by Franz Wiedenrich 3 decades before. And the teeth? They were chimpanzee teeth, which had been filed down. The file marks were even present when viewed under a microscope. Now, the age of the jaw was placed at 500 years, not quite the 500,000-year-old specimen that the world had originally been told about. And just a few years later, in 1959, news came out concerning the age of the skull.
Well, I was anxious to get the Piltdown mandible and cranium dated by radiocarbon.
This is Joseph Oakley, part of the team that had performed that original fluorine test.
In 1953, when we debunked Piltdown, that wasn't possible because techniques then available would have required the destruction of the whole mandible to provide enough carbon to date it by carbon-14. But by 1959, the late Professor de Vries in Cro-Magnon in the Netherlands had developed a radiocarbon dating technique to such an extent that he was able to date 1 gram of bone, and it was really very exciting, I thought, because it didn't come out as just a few years old, but as 500 years old, plus or minus 100. That's the actual determination, which means a date of AD 1450, a medieval bone. Well, I went into it, and I found that, in fact, this date of 500 years old made rather good sense, insofar as a very large amount of orangutan material had been collected and brought over to Great Britain in 1875. And when one examined some of this orangutan material from the Borneo caves, one found that the preservation of the bone was very, very similar to the Piltdown mandible, not in color, but in texture.
So the jig was up. The jawbone was 500 years old, and the skull was eventually carbon dated to somewhere between 500 to 700 years old. So now what? Well, science moves on. The unfortunate thing about the whole ordeal was what it did to the study of human evolution in the early 20th century. Belief that the Piltdown Man was indeed the mythical missing link led science down the wrong path for 40 years. While other fossils were turning up in Africa, real fossils of considerable age, they were largely ignored because the Piltdown Man was believed to hold the answers. Wrong answers, of course. One of those being the misconception that the human brain had expanded before mankind's diet had changed. The opposite is actually the case. One estimate puts the amount of scientific papers written as a direct result of the bones presented from Piltdown to be around 250. It could even be more than that. The study of human evolution was a confusing web of contradictions and wasted efforts. So the question remains, who did it? Most of the attention has fallen on the bones discoverer, Charles Dawson.
Very little in the way of positive evidence incriminating Dawson has really appeared in these 20 years. When I say that, I mean in regard to the Piltdown forgery itself.
This is biologist Joseph Viner speaking 20 years after he and the team had debunked the remains.
Various things have come to light which, as in my book, throws light on Dawson as very likely, the sort of man who would very likely to have done it. because of his curious activities in other fields. I felt that it was very necessary in 1955 to be as accurate and judicious as possible about the evidence. That's why I came to not exactly to a non-proven verdict, but as you said, it's been possible to prove that anybody else had done it, that the person who was in the right place at the right time, and I think with the right sort of knowledge, and I also think with the right motive, was Charles Dawson.
It makes sense that the focus would fall on Dawson. The funny thing is, it wasn't the first time for Dawson either. A study of Dawson's collection contained no less than 38 fakes. This according to archaeologist Miles Russell after a 3-year study conducted in 2003. In the show notes, I'll link to an article that Dr. Russell wrote for the BBC News on November 21st, 2003, exactly 50 years after the New York Times announced the hoax. 50 years to the day, in fact. It's a very interesting read about Dawson's other so-called discoveries. Today, there's little doubt that Dawson is the culprit. But did he work alone 100 years ago? Chances are that he did. But in 1970, a trunk that had belonged to Martin Hinton turned up. Hinton was a Sussex paleontologist at the time who also worked at the Natural History Museum. The trunk contained bones that had been stained in a way that was very similar to the way the Piltdown Man bones had been. Now, this doesn't mean that he had any hand in the fraud. He could have been experimenting in order to expose the hoax himself. We'll never know. Perhaps the most interesting theory concerns the implication of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Now, Doyle played golf at Piltdown when on vacation, and he was also an amateur collector with an interest in fossils. And in 1912, he published The Lost World. This book was a fictitious account of dinosaurs and an ape-like race of hominids that were still living in a remote section of the Amazon. In the book, Tarp Henry, a character, makes the bold claim that
if you're clever and know your business, you can fake a bone as easily as you can a photograph.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Piltdown Man. Or anything else, in fact. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback on today's show, please let me know by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can always find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.